So today we are talking about Kennedy, Johnson, and Vietnam. With what we're talking about today, we're going to see a lot of different things that we've already talked about. Like, we'll see us jump back into the past, basically talking about the civil rights movement, because the thing to not forget is that all throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis, all throughout Kennedy's assassination, all throughout like a lot of time with Vietnam too later on, I suppose, there's still a lot of civil rights movement stuff happening. So even though we just talked about Selma and MLK, and it feels like we moved past that, don't forget that all that stuff is still happening simultaneously with a lot of the stuff that we'll talk about today. So we'll talk about the election in 1960, the candidates, the first televised debates, which is actually a huge deal. The fact that these debates are like on TV for the first time, you get to see what people look like. So for example, there's plenty of different times where Biden or Trump, or even when it was Trump and Hillary Clinton, whoever, had been caught on TV doing like weird things, right? Anybody ever see that video of Hillary Clinton where she sees like a bunch of like balloons and she's like, wow, have you seen that? She looked weird, right? She didn't look quite right. It was a weird video, right? And then there's videos of, yeah, you have videos of obviously Trump and, the things that Trump does on TV. And then you have Biden with potential, I don't know, whatever video they're going to put out of like stereo, yeah, whatever, right? So there's plenty of different things where you can see where television and things being captured on video, this is new, right? So previously, when you're looking at a lot of debates and things like that, you're just listening on the radio. Now you have the addition of the television as well, and that's going to lead to some complications for some of the candidates. We have new Cold War strategies, the way that Kennedy differs from Eisenhower. We have the Third World. We have Cuba, talking about Fidel, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then the Berlin Crisis. This whole unit is like, how many crises can we have, right? The election in 1960, there's still a lot of deep unsettled issues in the United States. We have things like the Cold War, the U-2 spy plane incident. If you don't remember that, that's like when, Eisenhower's like leaving office and the Soviet Union shoots down that spy plane and they're like, hey, we found your spy plane. And Eisenhower's like, wasn't us, right? And then they're like, no, we know you did it. And he's like, okay, we did it, but we're not apologizing, right? And he leaves, and he leaves that letter where he's like, I wish I could say things are going to get better, but they're not. Good luck. Next guy, right? And then we have the space race with Sputnik, civil rights obviously being a thing, as Sputnik, sorry, Sputnik, whatever. The candidates, did I go too fast? Was there anything you had to fill out on there? I don't even know. Anyways, we have the candidates. So this is where it happens, right? These are our two guys who you probably recognize, Kennedy, and then you also probably recognize Nixon as well, right? So we have the Democrat, John F. Kennedy. He is known as this like handsome, charismatic guy. Even today, even nowadays, I'll pop on Twitter and I got Kennedy thirst traps on my Twitter. Anybody see that? I got Biden thirst traps on my Twitter too. People are like, "Whoa, young Biden," right? You never seen that? People are like head over heels for Kennedy, and people are head over heels for like young Biden, right? So sometimes that does play a role of people looking at this and being like, that's a good looking guy, especially looking up against like Nixon as well. Kennedy is this like young, attractive, charismatic, very good at public speaking, right? And all these things come together, especially when we look at the televised debate, right? Kennedy against Nixon is going to be a huge thing. Then we also have his Catholic faith, which surprisingly enough, and I didn't realize this for the longest time, is actually something that's used against him. Now, it's not like Kennedy's getting up there as like an atheist, right? Which is allowed, of course, but at the same time, it would probably be looked down upon. We might not have a established religion in the United States, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of ties to like Judeo-Christianity. So the big thing with Kennedy is that he's only the second at this time, candidate who is of the Catholic faith. And the big thing that people worry about here is they're like, oh, Kennedy, yeah, Kennedy's Catholic? They're like, oh no. That means that the Pope's going to be like behind the scenes, like pulling all the strings for what Kennedy's going to do in office. Right now, it sounds ridiculous to you and I, probably for the most part, that the Pope is going to be like the puppet master of the United States. But this is something that people are like throwing against him. They're like, can we trust Kennedy because he's Catholic? And what kind of control will the Catholic Church have? Obviously, Kennedy overcomes a lot of those accusations and the things that might go with it, right? It's not to say that this is like the biggest thing in the news, but it's definitely things that people are talking about, right? Republican Richard Nixon. Funny enough, before this, Nixon is already kind of viewed as like a shady individual, and yet later on we still elect him to be president of the United States. But, you know, Nixon goes on, he's the VP for Eisenhower, which is a huge deal. Obviously, Biden VP for Obama. Several other VPs have been elected as president later on, right? He's a former leader of the HUAC. It is the first time in U.S. history that both of these candidates are born in the 20th century. So they're not too different age-wise, but overall, Kennedy is far better suited for something like television. And we'll see that with the televised debates. In these first televised debates, reason why I bring up Kennedy's appearance so much is because it matters, right? The way that our candidates look on television matters. The way that our candidates can appeal to the public matters. Now, Nixon, prior to these debates, was like sick. He was sick for like 4 weeks. He had like the flu. He was on the campaign trail. He was pale. He was like feverish. In fact, when he got there, he had like a low-grade fever. He got it. There's another thing that says that he had bad luck. You know, he stepped out of his car and he banged his knee really hard too, right before going out and preparing for his speeches. Kennedy, on the other hand, was sitting in like a hotel for the entire weekend, probably hanging out with like Marilyn Monroe or something, and practicing his speeches to her. So who knows, right? Kennedy is well rested. He's very tan, right? Which sounds weird, and it's funny that I'm bringing these things up, I'm sure. But Kennedy's super tan, and Nixon is very pale and like sickly looking. Kennedy's tan from campaigning, and this plays a role because there's actually a point where both of the men refuse to put on makeup for television. And this is something they're not used to, right? It's not a normal thing at this time for you to stand up there and be in front of the entire nation on TV and basically addressing everybody. Previously, you'd be doing this on the radio. So you wouldn't really have to, you'd probably show up in pajamas if you really wanted to. I mean, yeah, it would come out into the news, of course, but like, you're not looking at 60 million, however many million people watching you live on TV. So what we start to see, and I know some of you have been on stages before, you know that stage lights can be pretty hot. Nixon, he has to wear this stuff called like, it's like lazy shave. It's basically like your old kind of powder that would stop, you know, the look of maybe your 5 o'clock shag, right? Because Nixon had such facial hair that he could shave it and like 30 minutes later, it's like, oh, Nixon's growing his beard again, right? And so they're trying to make him look better for television. So his advisors are like, Nixon, you got to put this on. You have to put on the lazy shave. He puts it on. And then he gets in front of a bunch of people and he starts sweating like profusely. So Nixon basically looks like he's melting and falling apart up there the whole time. And Kennedy, being tan, also not wearing makeup, but still looking better on television because he doesn't look so sickly. And again, it's in black and white, right? They're standing up there and Kennedy looks really good. He's good posture. Nixon not really feeling great. There's a couple of times where Nixon like looks over to the side to like address a reporter or something. And people like, they're like, Nixon is, he's too shifty, right? Like he's a shifty individual. And so all these things kind of play a role. But at the same time, the radio, if you're listening on the radio, you're like, man, I think Nixon won. If you're watching on TV, you're like, pretty sure Kennedy won. And that just goes to show how close it is. In fact, it's one of the closest presidential elections since 1888.
So Kennedy is the win?
Yes, on TV. But on radio, if you're listening, now granted, during this time, we're making that transition. A lot more people are watching on TV than listening on radio. In the past, it would have been different, obviously, because there would be no TV. So that is what you see. Moving forward, you know, again, people who watch the debate on television overwhelmingly believe Kennedy had won. Radio listeners, which were the smaller audience, believe Nixon had won. All of the, you know, criticisms that I've given of Nixon's appearance here, it doesn't mean that he wasn't a good debater. He was really good on the stage. He did a great job. He just didn't look the part. He's also wearing this like weird gray suit, and it doesn't help with his, I know, all these things are weird. Yeah.
So I think that Kennedy actually did research, and he actually went to the studio beforehand and said, oh, there's this black line background. He said, I'm going to go be in a black suit, so I stand out.
Absolutely wouldn't surprise me at all, considering Kennedy was in the area, too, for a little while. Like, he was there. Basically, Kennedy had like a home game, right? Nixon, and you're right, you know, Nixon, especially on this background, first off, you're on black and white TV, right? you're on like a weird background that wouldn't really match with his suit. And he's also way paler than Kennedy. So having that gray suit, people were like, wow, this guy almost looks like translucent. Like he doesn't look good, right? And one of the biggest things with any sort of presidential candidate, especially as we look at our older candidates, I mean, we had two of the oldest candidates in like forever a while ago, recently, right? The biggest thing you're looking for them is, do they look healthy, right? And so looking at Nixon, people are like, I don't know about this guy. Anyways, Kennedy takes over. He comes in, he knows that the U.S. is seen as inferior. Now, Eisenhower was a lot heavier-handed than Truman was, obviously, but Kennedy's coming over. He's like, there's been some major gaps in the Cold War. There's some serious things that we need to work on. His first goal is to build up the armed forces. Eisenhower obviously was like, if anybody does anything to me, I will drop all of the bombs on you. And Kennedy's more like, maybe we'll do that, right? Maybe we will, but we don't have to, Dwight. Like, we don't have to drop all the bombs, but we could, right? And that's more in line of like what Kennedy's thinking. Kennedy's like, massive retaliation, let's call that like option C, all right? Let's try and do a couple of other things before we get there. He wants to be able to fight any type of conflict, whether it be amphibious, right, building up the Navy, or in the air, or whatever you have to do. He wants to improve the military's conventional forces. Am I going too fast if I move on? Okay. He does a couple of different things too, like he adds in like the Green Berets, right? So it's basically a special operations force. And he wants to work more for deterrence. Kennedy knows, he's like, if we build up our military, if we make our military big enough, if we have enough weapons and we have enough tanks and boats and whatever, that we can deter people. His big goal is to like look so big, strong, and tough that nobody wants to pick a fight with us. On the other hand, Eisenhower was like, let's throw all of our money into nukes because they're great, and also it'll save us money in the long run. The long run, oh my God. How should the United States fight the Cold War? Eisenhower basically saying, like, we need to watch our military spending, though at the same time, he was the guy who was like, let's spend all of our money on bombs. And then Kennedy's like, I'm going to throw a bunch of money into defense. And it's not in the expectation of war, but it's in the expectation of preserving peace, which is ironic. But at the same time, I get somewhat what he's going for. But at the same time, there's also every other country that's involved in world disputes right now. If you're involved in the whole NATO versus Warsaw Pact situation, you're probably beefing up your defense system as well. We have the third world, which if you've ever heard the term third world country, oftentimes the way that we view it, I would say in the modern day, is more of like a derogatory term, maybe even an insult to many countries. What this meant when it first came around was more so that there was three worlds. And what I mean by that is there is the NATO capitalist democracy world. There is the Warsaw Pact communist, world with Stalin and the Soviet Union and Khrushchev and all these other guys. There's that world, this world, and then there's the third world, which is everybody who's not aligned with either the Soviets or basically the U.S. in democracy, right? So that is where it comes from. You have these developing nations in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and we start to put in a bunch of programs to strengthen these countries. Obviously, it's not always just out of the good grace of our heart. We have the Peace Corps. We're sending American volunteers around the world on these missions of freedom. Reason being is because, Kennedy is looking at this and he's like, well, the Soviets were already doing that. And that, first off, doesn't make us look great when the big bad enemy is out there sending out all their volunteers with doctors and nurses and teachers and, everybody else who's kind of going through and prepping to save other people abroad. The U.S. didn't have a program like that. Kennedy wanted to involve Americans more actively in the cause of global democracy, peace, development, and freedom. So what you're looking at and seeing here is that Kennedy is like, okay, well, if the big bad Russians have that going on, and it's going to all these developing countries who really haven't chosen a side, now, what's going to look better? Is it going to look better when the U.S. doesn't go over there and help out, or is it going to look better if the U.S. does, right? What might gear them more towards maybe a more friendly relationship? We also have communist Cuba. Cuba in 1959, communist revolution overthrows the Cuban government. We have this guy, Fidel Castro. He is kind of like, he He is, yeah. He's got, yeah.
Was it in this class or History of the 60s where we talked about that he's the guy that like was running the wall?
Probably, I think it was this one. That's actually how he earned a nickname. He got this nickname El Loco, right? And the reason being is, like Addison said, he did things like ride bikes full speed into brick walls just to show the people around him that he would do it, right? Like, I'll ride my bike down this hill into that brick wall just to show you that I'm, like, man enough, right? And I'm not afraid, and I have all this kind of motivation. Castro, he's the leader. He accepts economic and military aid from the USSR. So, very quickly, Cuba is aligning with the Soviets. That's going to be an issue for us. There's a lot of anti-American sentiment, and this only gets worse, right? Fidel comes in. He already doesn't really like the Americans. He doesn't really love capitalism or anything like that. It only gets worse after the stuff that we're going to talk about in a minute. He's got this kind of policy of exiling or executing all opponents. So, we have this situation called the Bay of Pigs. This is where I would say we probably turned a corner with our relationship with Cuba. We see that Fidel is there. We see that there's a lot of communism in Cuba, and obviously it's a big deal for us because they're 90 miles away from like the coast of Florida. They're really close to the United States. If we are viewing communism as this like scary disease that's spreading across the world, Cuba is probably the closest situation that we have where it could leach over and kind of jump over to the United States. And then we also have eventually the issue of like weapons. With the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, the U.S. had a failed attempt to remove Fidel Castro from power in Cuba, and this is not the only failed attempt. There are so many different failed attempts to kill Castro or get rid of him that there's literally like whole books and movies about it. I mean, there are things like exploding cigar tips. There's talk about how the CIA worked with the mafia to try and kill Castro and send like mobsters over there. There's different talks about how there was a time where somebody laced Castro's room with like LSD or somehow and tried to make him get super drugged up so that he would make a fool of himself in front of his people. There's so many different things, right? There's a plenty of different times where we tried to remove Castro and we just absolutely failed. And of all the nationally kind of televised issues there, the Bay of Pigs is like out in the open as one of the bigger failures of when this happened. The CIA trained Cuban exiles to take over Cuba, and in that process, the Cuban military basically was just like, no, and just destroyed them. Like, absolutely demolished the Cuban exiles. It was an embarrassment to the U.S. It was an embarrassment to Kennedy. This is something that the Cubans were like, yeah, the U.S. obviously did this, and Kennedy couldn't really hide the fact that it happened. And so this leads to even more anger from Castro towards the U.S., right? And that directly leads into the next thing that we'll talk about, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis. This has got to be one of the most tense 13 days in U.S. history, probably one of the most dangerous 13 days in U.S. history. The U.S. intelligence discovered that the Soviets were building missile sites in Cuba. Now, Cuba at first was like, no, we're not. We didn't do that, right? And then eventually we showed them a picture, and we're like, we took a picture of it, and they're like, okay, well, we're only building them to protect from another invasion like the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy gets on TV, delivers this really dramatic television address, probably rightfully so, because we're finding out that Cuba is nuclear capable. And again, they're 90 miles away from the United States, so people are kind of freaking out. There's an approval of a blockade, and then this 13 days, this is the length of time that the Cuban Missile Crisis was ongoing. That's 13 days of people probably not sleeping too much, which leads to more danger because if you're a head of state and the longer you're not sleeping, the more stressed out you get, the more erratic you get, the more likely you get to push the button. There's other things that happen too that are a little bit more, kind of insane. We also have a lot of close calls. In fact, this is probably one of the closest calls that we've ever seen towards like serious nuclear warfare. On October 27th, 12 U.S. Navy warships located the Soviet submarine B-59 near Cuba. They started to drop depth charges to force the submarine to come to the surface for identification, not knowing that it was armed with nuclear-tipped torpedoes. B-59 had not been in contact with Moscow for several days, and the crew didn't know if war had broken out or not. So imagine you're on a submarine as somebody who's in the Soviet Union, and somebody above you starts dropping bombs on you, to not that you know, but to get you to rise up. This is a common kind of practice, dropping depth charges to force a submarine to rise up. And they're like, we don't know if World War III is happening or not. We have nuclear-tipped missiles. Should we fire these or not? Now, has anybody ever seen The Hunt for Red October? Probably not. Maybe. Have you seen it? Yeah. It's kind of like that. It's kind of like that situation. Dropping these bombs, and people are like on board the submarine. They're like, we should definitely fire these nukes, right? But what happens here is the captain is like super adamant. The guy in charge of the submarine is like, we should totally do this. Let's send these nukes. Let's blow up the United States. The other officer, there's 3 primary officers, Vasily Arkhipov being one. The other officer alongside with the captain is like, yeah, I'm with that. Like, let's totally blow up the United States. And then Vasily's like, well, I don't know if we should, right? And that one guy alone saying no is probably the reason why there wasn't some serious nuclear warfare that happened that day. Which is like, that's literally how close it got. 2 out of 3, right? The launch of that torpedo could have possibly started nuclear warfare between the 2 nations. In 2002, Thomas Blanton, director of National Security Archives, said that the guy called Vasily Arkhipov saved the world. These are the images. I know that they look like they were kind of taken with a toaster, but, you know, they're old school, right? So we caught them, right? We didn't catch them in 4K. We caught them in like 144p or something. Either way, we got them. We're like, you definitely have missile sites here. You can't lie about it anymore. And they're like, okay, I guess we do, right? And so this whole thing kind of eventually ends in a compromise, as many things do. The Soviets dismantled their Cuban missiles. The Soviets are like, all right, we'll take them down, right? The U.S. is like, okay, you have to make like a very public display of this. Tell the world that you're taking them down. Soviets are like, okay, we'll do it. But at the same time, you have to get rid of your missiles in Turkey and Italy, which is another thing that is commonly overlooked, is that the U.S. was basically like, hey, we're going to set our nukes here. And then the Cubans were like, hey, Soviets, you can bring your nukes here. And then we were like, whoa, why would you put your nukes so close to us when we had just literally done the same thing to the Soviets, right? So it's no surprise that they were probably pretty irritated and a little bit worried about that as well. Either way, it becomes a compromise where we take our missiles down, they take theirs down, and then we have a couple of results of the crisis. Last 2 slides, stay with me. We have a hotline that is implemented. They're like, hey, you know how we couldn't get a hold of anybody on that submarine? Maybe we should get like a big red phone that gets us in contact with anybody when we need to talk about something relating to nuclear warfare. So this is the phone that if it rings and you don't answer it, that's probably an issue, right? This is the one that if it rings, you got to answer it, right? That is the hotline that is installed. It basically connects all the heads of state so that you can all talk about what the heck is going on, right? There's also the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which is just the U.S. and Soviet Union ending above ground testing. You can still blow up bombs, just don't do it where we can see it, right? And try and do it underground is the kind of thought process there.
So if you set a bomb underneath ground, you're going to cave in whatever you're blowing it up in.
It's whatever their whole, it's not like you're just digging a hole and, you know, blowing it up. I don't know the exact process of the nuclear testing, but whatever situation they use, you know, it's contained in whatever way. That being said, the nuclear waste and the nuclear probably pollution that comes with that, probably not as contained, and there's definitely cause for alarm there, right? The Berlin crisis, which is the last thing that we'll talk about today. This is basically, you know, a meeting where Kennedy is getting over to Germany. So if you remember, again, I know the timeline's kind of all messed up right now, but they're looking at this and they're like, yeah, East Germany's not doing so great under the Soviets. West Germany's looking pretty good under the Allied troops. And so it doesn't look great for Khrushchev. So he's pretty upset about that. He says that the presence of the U.S. there is intolerable. Kennedy's standing firm with the rights of West Berliners. And, you know, Khrushchev eventually demands the end of a U.S. presence in Berlin. He ends up creating the Berlin Wall, which is a pretty big symbolic thing, especially it's a real thing. Obviously, it stops the movement of people, but it's symbolically very against the idea of democracy with the limitation of movement. It also divides a bunch of families, kind of similar to what we see with the situation in North and South Korea, cutting right in half, getting, you know, it's not like an East and West Berlin existed before, right? You may have had family on the other side. Now all of a sudden you can't go visit them. You can't see them. There is no kind of walking in between. Kennedy doesn't like this. He sends more troops to Berlin. And then things get even more tense as the Russians and U.S. kind of move their tanks within the sight of each other. And, this is something that's going to stick around until like at least 89, until Gorbachev and you have Reagan with the whole Mr. Gorbachev tear that wall down situation. Either way, that is what we have for today for the notes. The rest of the class time is your guys' to use how you may please. If you have missing assignments, I would recommend that you do those. If you want to get a head start on those day 3 notes, even though it's jumping ahead, you may feel free to do that as well. Other than that, please do check your Skyward. See what your grade is. See what you're missing. See what I can help you on. See what we can work together on. Okay? Yes.